Well, hello, listeners, and welcome back to Our Experts. I am Carol Matichka, your host, bringing you interesting perspectives on the realm of pharmacy. And today is no different. We are very lucky to have a wonderful guest, Dean Peter Swaan. So, Dean Swaan, or Dr. Swaan, is the University of Florida College of Pharmacy Dean, and he has an extensive experience in regards to academia and research. So Dr. Swaan has worked for the University of Michigan, University of California, San Francisco, the Ohio State University, as well as the University of Michigan. And we've been so lucky to have him now here with us at the University of Florida. His research has been extensive in the realm of drug development, with a particular interest in transporters as targets for prodrugs. So welcome, Dean Swaan. Thank you for being on the show.
And thank you for having me. It's really exciting, this podcast, and look forward to our discussion. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. So before we get into any other questions, I like to ask my guests this. How did you first become interested in pharmacy?
That's a great question, of course. So I actually grew up with a pharmacy across the street. So actually, my parents always thought that I would work there in the future. That actually never transpired. But so I always was attracted to medicine initially, and so I have very poor eyesight, and I wanted to become an ophthalmologist. But at the time, the medicine system, or the medical school system in the Netherlands, they had a lottery, or a stop for students. So I didn't get in on my first try. So I was like, well, I'll take another healthcare, stopgap course, and I enrolled in pharmacy. I thought it was so much fun in my first year that I never looked back. I didn't even apply to medical school the next year, and I just continued on with pharmacy as my profession. So that's how my interest started. So it wasn't like I always wanted to be a pharmacist, but once I got involved, I never looked back.
That's awesome. And isn't it funny? That's how life goes a lot of the times, right?
Serendipity.
Ab-
That's our guiding principle, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So before we get into your thoughts on pharmacy education, share a little bit about your research background, because I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, so interestingly, back in the day, I should say, in pharmacy school, we all had to do a research project, and so I got involved with a mentor by the name of Joseph Tucker, and he was collaborating with the cancer hospital in Amsterdam. And so what I did as my undergraduate research project, which was supposed to last only 3 months, but it turned out to become a year, was we made clinical batches of pamidronate for to against bone loss during chemotherapy.
Oh,
And
wow.
so my task was to, basically tablet these in a sterile GMP environment to the specifications that the local hospital pharmacist had prescribed. And so I did that for almost a year, and that was a lot of fun. And based on that experience, my advisor at the time asked me, well, do you want to do your PhD? And that's how I started doing my studies, my advanced studies in pharmacy. So that kind of started my passion for research. And so, the funny thing was, when I started my PhD in the Department of Biopharmaceutics at the University of Utrecht, my advisor asked the very simple question, there are drugs that are not very absorbed in the GI tract. How can we make non-absorbable drugs more absorbable? And that sounds like such a simple question, but the simple questions are always the hardest to answer. And that really led me on a path to explore transporters in the gut. And so at the time, there were no there were clones of transporters. We knew that, some drugs were absorbed by transport systems in the GI tract, So we started exploring this as a way of making drugs more absorbable by creating these Trojan horse approaches. So we would couple an amino acid or a small peptide to a drug and then try and smuggle them in through a transport system in the gut to make them better absorbed. And it worked. And it wasn't until much later that these transporters were cloned and expressed in cell systems. But we started with tissues, animal tissue, usually rat intestine, placed in Ussing chambers. But later on, of course, everything became cell culture and became much easier to study. And that's how I started my career in research. The transporters have always fascinated me because they were such a burgeoning field in the 1990s and the early 2000s. That even the FDA started to pay attention to them. So, and that's how I got involved in transporter research. I would say to this day.
So important, because that's often the factor or the step in which, we can't get drugs in there, and we've got to make sure the transport system is working well. So fascinating research. Thank you for sharing that. And along those same lines, it might be, I think, beneficial for our listeners to understand the relationship between research and education, because sometimes people feel like there's a separation between research and education and the university system, but they're so important to be intertwined. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think that innovation comes from research, right? So I think the best pharmacy programs in the country or in the world are all research driven. In an academia, you can explore the latest developments, you can explore the latest, therapeutic breakthroughs. There are clinical trials with experimental drugs going on. So I think the education follows the research. And so a research intensive university or pharmacy program will lead the way in how we're educating our pharmacy students. And not just our pharmacy students, we also educate the FDA on the latest developments, because all the new exploratory mechanisms, you look at techniques like CRISPR-Cas9, or AI tools in pharmacy or in drug discovery, all those are explored at research institutions. So that connection is more easily translated by the researchers who are also teaching our students. And so they get a first look at the latest breakthroughs and the latest developments because they're exposed to it sooner. And I think that's why that connection between research and education is so important.
And really, at the base of education is you want our students to be curious, right? We want that curiosity,
right.
and that's research. And we can provide information all day long, but you can find information anywhere. But making them curious and making them really interested in exploring more and digging deeper is so important. So, all right, well, thank you so much for that information. And let's then shift gears a little bit. We will talk about education today, and you bring a very expansive background to us. You trained in the Netherlands, but then you worked in some of the biggest universities in the U.S. throughout the past years. So how has your experience training in the Netherlands shaped you in regards to pharmacy education here in the U.S.?
That's actually a question I haven't really thought about much, because you kind of take your education for granted. But if I look at parallels, I think a lot of the textbooks that I used or that were used in my pharmacy training are the same that are used currently in the US. So one example is Martin's Physical Pharmacy, which at the time I didn't like very much, but I've used in my teaching at pharmacy schools ever since. And so most of the textbooks we used were in English, some in German, but it really allowed. I think there's many parallels. I mean, there's some differences too, because the way that pharmacy is practiced in the Netherlands is I would say, slightly different from how it's practiced here. But a lot of the trends that you're seeing most pharmacies were independent at the time of my study. But now you're seeing the same thing, that conglomerates are forming, and that
Oh, wow.
there's communities of pharmacy chains that are being set up. So it has changed a bit, but I would say there's a lot of parallels. You don't see what you have in the US, where we're so used to seeing a CVS or a Walgreens as being a large, a convenience store with a pharmacy attached to it, or even at your local grocery store. You don't see that in Europe much. I mean, most pharmacies are independent buildings, and so they're only devoted to that, right? And you don't see all the additional OTC products that you normally see within a CVS. You don't really see that there. It's very minimal. It's devoted to just prescriptions and maybe some other services, but that's it.
Do pharmacists have more prescribing rights over there, or are they able to provide more prescription drugs?
Great question. That's the $60,000 question, right?
Right.
So, not in the Netherlands, but I know that there are great strides being made in England. Like in
Yes.
England, I would say a majority of pharmacists now have prescribing rights or functions. And they're kind of a trailblazer right now. I mean, I saw a talk by a pharmacist at the City College of London who outlined all the strides they've made in that area. So I think we're going to see a push worldwide for pharmacists to have better prescribing rights, right? Because the healthcare system in every country in the world is under pressure. It's
Sure.
strained, and the time that physicians can spend with a patient are becoming fewer and fewer hours. It's in 15-minute increments these days. So my vision of that is that a physician would diagnose the disease and leave it to the pharmacist to prescribe the correct medication, while looking at all the contraindications, the drug-drug interactions, possibilities, and work as a team together. We're seeing that already, but I think in the future we're going to see it a lot more. I also want to add to that our students nowadays are not shy, right? They're very eager to work with their colleagues in other healthcare areas, like the primary care physicians, with nurses, nurse practitioners, just to give the best care to patients. And I think the old model with the physician on top dictating everything that happens in the healthcare realm is over. And if you followed the AMA descriptions, and if you follow APHA, I think it's correct that the majority of physicians lean more on pharmacists these days than they ever have, because they need to be a team.
Absolutely.
The siloed, healthcare professional is over. That's no longer a model that can work for us.
Yeah, we absolutely have to work it as a team. If we're going to be able to have the best patient outcomes, it has to be a team effort. I couldn't agree with you more. And you were talking a little bit about what we're seeing overseas, and our program that we have with the short study abroad for our students to be able to go and physically see the practices in these other countries has been absolutely amazing. One of my favorite things, and I hear that from students too, that they love seeing the differences, but also the similarities and the parallels. Right. And we can learn from each other that way. So thank you for all of that. And you've also been at several institutions across the U.S., and I know you've seen a lot of changes in regards to pharmacy over the years. So what are maybe some key differences you've seen in regards to those states compared to what you're seeing here in Florida? Or are there any?
The state laws are different, right?
Sure.
So I think that's the key thing to look at, that you have differences in state laws. And of course, the the pharmacy institute, program needs to adapt to that. But I think overall, the basis of education is the same. I think it's more the delivery method that is slightly different. One thing that struck me when I came to Florida, I was very impressed with the team-based learning and the implementation of the flipped classroom in having just recorded lectures, and that the students come prepared to work on case studies and other team-based approaches. I think the way that the content is delivered is different from place to place, but I think that the content itself is pretty similar. I mean,
Sure.
of course, we all have to look at our accreditation standards,
Right.
and we all have to adhere to those if we want to be accredited. So I feel that there's a lot of similarities. It's just the way that the profession is being taught is different from state to state, and also within a state from institution to institution. There's places where the lecture is still the prevailing method of delivery, even though
Sure.
we all know that that's not conducive to the best learning environment for students. But we're still seeing that. So yeah, that's in a nutshell what I think is different from state to state.
Sure. And I think certainly we've learned from some states who are a little bit ahead of Florida in regards to what their pharmacists can do, but I feel like Florida's really catching up, which has been amazing to see the push that we have here in the state in regards to test and treat, chronic disease
Yeah.
state management, all of that. And just like you, I'm so impressed with being able to work in teams, but that flipped classroom is so important to students nowadays. They want to be
Yeah.
able to take in the material on their own time, but then be able to come into the classroom and really utilize that information and to think through the process, which is extremely important. So, what then ultimately brought you to us, which we've been so lucky to have you here in Florida?
Well, I think, if you look at what are some of the top institutions of pharmacy in the country, I mean, clearly Florida is one of the top contenders. I mean, yes, we're ranked number 5, and that's great. I mean, but I think when you look at the history, that Florida has always been on the radar as a trailblazer in various areas, especially pharmacotherapy, pharmacogenetics, and genomics. That's what it's known for. And so, of course, you can't ignore that. So if you look at the different colleges of pharmacy in the country, I think Florida stands out as one of the top institutions, and that was attractive to me. I
Sure.
wanted to know more about it, and I'm actually very proud to be leading such a renowned institution to its next phase.
Well, we're lucky to have you, and you came at such a great time, having celebrated the centennial during
Nice.
your
Yeah.
time with us. So that's been
Yeah.
amazing. So,
Yeah, I think one thing I want to add too is
sure.
the quality of the students. I've been really impressed with the students so far. Everyone I talk to is really engaged and professional, and just you can see that quality too in how much in demand our students are across the country. Anyone who applies for a residency anywhere usually gets their top choice, gets an offer from their top choice. So that's been tremendous. I'm really enjoying seeing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And that's why we continue to hold that top spot in regards to
Yeah.
residency placements as well. So
Right. Yeah.
fantastic. So, where do you see pharmacy education heading in the next few years?
Uh, I think that pharmacy education, we're going to see new areas that we have to concentrate on. It's become tough because if I draw the comparison, and you probably have the same thing, Carol. You look at when you were studying pharmacy and compare it to now, just the sheer number of different drugs that are on the market, the sheer number of, the new knowledge, uh, you know, new therapy classes, new drug classes that you have to know as a student are vastly different. It's a
Sure.
larger number.
Yeah.
So I think we're more the educational system is moving more towards how do you get that information at your fingertips as fast as possible, right? And with that, I would be remiss if I didn't mention AI
Yep, that was
because
going to be a question of mine.
I know that's probably your next question,
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
telehealth even. I mean, pharmaceutical telehealth is also here to stay because
Yeah.
we're seeing that um, consults or consultants will be made by telehealth. We're seeing in our hospital here in Gainesville that for after hours we have a pharmacy kiosk, and the patient will have to go there. The pharmacist is not on site; they are at an undisclosed location. But the patient needs to first speak with the pharmacist before their drugs are released through the kiosk. So I think having that expertise, so education will change in terms of AI tools, telehealth, but also using real world data, right? Because
Sure.
what is a pharmacist better at than to collect data, prescription data, side effect data? I mean, people talk to their pharmacists. They will say, oh, well, I didn't feel so great yesterday about this. I mean, could that be a side effect? More so than they speak with their physicians about it because we're much more approachable. So I think having a focus on what more can a pharmacist do for the patient, I think that's where we're going with the education too. And how can we collect the data, and how do we analyze the data, right?
Right.
That's I think a new focal point as well.
And you made a good point about us being so accessible, which has always been
Yeah,
such an important piece of our ability to connect with our
yeah,
patients.
yeah,
And so I know we're trying to move away somewhat from the product, but then we want to make sure that we continue to be accessible as well, because it's those touch points with our patients when we do see
yeah,
somebody coming up and bringing, let's say, ibuprofen, and you recognize they're on a blood thinner to the
yeah,
counter. Just all those touch points. That's really important in making sure we're taking care of our patients. So it'll be
yeah.
interesting as
And
we.
just sorry to interrupt you,
No,
Carol,
you're
but
fine.
that's where I think it's also dangerous because that touch point is so important, but with the push for mail order pharmacy,
Mhm.
taking away that interaction, I think is a mistake. I understand that for cost savings you don't want to have a pharmacist on staff 24/7, but it's a really important service. So
Right, and
yeah,
looking at the potential law that could be put into place here in
yeah,
Florida, where you could have one pharmacist overseeing several pharmacies,
yeah,
again, losing that touch with that patient and that safety net, it does worry me. So,
yeah, yeah.
so do you have any advice maybe for those who are interested in pursuing academia? What are your thoughts there?
Um, well, so for academic pharmacy, I think in the clinical realm, there's a lot to do. I think just from the perspective of what can pharmacists really do. We always talk about practicing at the top of your license. I
Right.
think in academia, that's exactly what you can do. So if you become part of a healthcare team, your clinical services will make an impact. We're already seeing that with several programs that we have launched here at the University of Florida, embedding pharmacists in teams that really look at outcomes for the patients. But academic pharmacy, in the research sphere is also, I think, a very attractive proposition.
Sure.
I would say we get a good number of students every year who are interested in research and having those experiences. And our faculty are always happy to provide, a place in their lab so they can have, a feel for what research is really about. Going that route, would require a PhD and some more studying, but I think it can be very satisfying because being at the forefront of developing a new therapy, looking for a new target, drug discovery targets is ultimately, very satisfying if that leads to better human health.
Sure. And when I say it, in regards to academia, and there's almost this separation, but if you think about pharmacists, we are all academicians to some degree, teaching our
Yeah.
interns who are coming in, patients who are coming in. So one of the things that I always say too, there are these different teaching certificate programs out there. UF has one as well, and that could be a potential option if people are looking to try to get in a little bit in regards to the teaching realm. But we are all teachers, right? We truly are.
We are. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
That's part of lifelong learning, right?
absolutely. So important too. So thank you, Dr. Swaan. This has been awesome to be able to talk to you today. I know you're super busy. Is there anything else you want to leave our audience with today?
Um, I just want to thank you for having me on your podcast, Carol. It's been a pleasure, absolutely, to speak with you about what is going on in academic pharmacy. And the only thing I want to say as in closing is go Gators.
Go Gators. I love it. That's perfect. Thank you so much, Dean Swaan. And thank you all for taking the time to listen today. If you want to support our show, please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast as well as the YouTube channel. Take care, everyone.